The last session of this chapter is explaining about enzyme inhibition. Before we go to the term inhibition, let us see a particular term called allosteric enzyme. These enzymes, that is allosteric enzymes, are those which change their conformation when they bind with the substrate. For that, these enzymes are having an additional binding site for substrate other than the active site. The normal binding place of a substrate to enzyme is termed as active site. But for these allosteric enzymes, there will be another part, another area or additional binding site for substrate to attack. The binding brings about conformational changes and thereby changing its catalytic property. And these type of substrate that bind to allosteric site are termed as effectors or modulators. For example, glycogen phosphorylase or phosphofructokinase can be given as an example for allosteric enzymes. Coming to the term enzyme inhibition, many substances can reduce or eliminate the catalytic activity of specific enzymes. These substances are termed as inhibitors. The substances which reduce or eliminate the catalytic activity of a particular enzyme is termed as inhibitor. Inhibitors are compounds that bind to an enzyme and prevent either the formation of enzyme substrate complex or the breakdown to enzyme and product. They can be termed as inhibitors. This inhibition can take place in different mechanism, which can be competitive inhibition, non-competitive inhibition, or uncompetitive inhibition. The binding of inhibitor to enzyme, or the difference, the deviation in the degradation of the enzyme substrate complex. Whatever may be the case, it can happen in three mechanisms, that is competitive inhibition, non-competitive inhibition, and uncompetitive inhibition. In competitive inhibition, the molecule other than the substrate, that is the inhibitor and the substrate, will have same conformation. In this type of competitive inhibition, the structure of competitive inhibitor resembles the structure of the substrate of the enzyme. So what will happen? If both are having same structure, same conformation, then inhibitor will bind with the active site of the enzyme and substrate cannot bind to that. So more inhibitor and substrate both are having same conformation. So inhibitor will attack the active site of the enzyme and form enzyme inhibitor complex. And the substrate cannot form or cannot attack the active site and it cannot form the enzyme substrate complex. So we cannot form the normal product. So this type of inhibition, that is, it is competing. The inhibitor is competing with the substrate. That type of substrate or inhibition is termed as competitive inhibition. In non-competitive inhibition, the molecule binding to a site other than the active site. The inhibitor is not attacking at the active site of the enzyme, but at another site, so that the conformation of the active site changes. This is the conformation of substrate and this is the conformation of the inhibitor. It differs. It does not have the same conformation of substrate and inhibitor. But still, what will happen is when the inhibitor attacks the enzyme, then the active site conformation changes. So to have a enzyme substrate complex formation, the conformation of the substrate and the active site should be identical so that it can fit in the active site properly. But as there is a change in the conformation of the active site, the substrate cannot occupy the active site, and it will prevent the formation of again enzyme substrate complex. This type of inhibition is termed as non-competitive inhibition. So here the conformation of substrate and inhibitor is not matching, but still the inhibitor is prohibiting the formation of enzyme substrate complex. Coming to uncompetitive inhibition, here the inhibitor does not combine with the free enzyme or affect its reaction with its normal substrate, but it combines with the enzyme substrate complex, an inactive enzyme substrate inhibitor complex. All the three will be joined together and form ESI, enzyme substrate inhibitor complex, will be formed, and which cannot undergo further reaction to yield the normal product. Once the enzyme is combining with the substrate to form enzyme substrate complex, an inhibitor attack the enzyme substrate complex to form an ESI complex. So normal degradation of this ESI complex to normal product will be blocked, and the formation of normal product will not happen. This type of inhibition is termed as uncompetitive inhibition. If we compare the competitive and non-competitive inhibition, competitive inhibitors are substrate analogs, and they bind directly to the empty active site, thus blocking it by not reacting. Then in competitive inhibitor, the effect that can be reversed. It can be reversed. The action, the effect of inhibitors can be reversed by increasing the substrate concentration. If there are more concentration of the substrate, then substrate will go and occupy the active site of the enzyme and form enzyme substrate complex. In the case of non-competitive inhibition, they are not substrate analogs, and they bind at another site other than the active site. Whether the substrate occupy it or not, it causes a conformational change which prevent the reaction from occurring. So this type of inhibition, that is non-competitive inhibition, cannot be reversed by increasing the substrate concentration. So in this session, we have seen different type of enzyme inhibition. How an inhibitor can prevent the enzyme substrate complex formation or its degradation to form normal product. And what are the mechanism for different inhibition like competitive, non-competitive and uncompetitive inhibition.